Well, it's a late one this time, and that is a more powerful lamp than I usually assume it to be. But yeah, it's a late one. I wanted to start making the rough videos, draft videos, I don't know, crappy versions of the videos I want to make in proper quality later. So I'm going to start with a brief analysis of genre because what I'm working with will largely be what's known as genre fiction. And genre fiction, from my perspective, is when the story is very much about the world that it's set in. It's a tour of that world as much as it is a story about the people in it. Proper genre fiction cannot exist without the genre it's in. Proper sci fi cannot exist without the sci-fi element. Proper fantasy cannot exist without the fantasy element. Crappy sci-fi and crappy fantasy can exist without their genre elements because they're just basic stories with all of the other stuff slapped on. The magic doesn't really matter. The spaceships don't really matter. It's just an ordinary story, and you've got your sci-fi or fantasy or horror or whatever elements slapped on. But proper genre fiction is as much about the genre as it is about the fiction. If it's not genre fiction and it's not crappy, it's usually, I won't say slice of life stories, but stories that could be assumed to be real. They could be based on true stories, even if they're not. They could be based on true crimes, on true personal experiences. They could be biographies or anything of that kind. Um, but they don't need some kind of genre element to really function. And um, that actually becomes a more complicated thing when you go into it because there are multiple categories of genre that usually get mixed up together as just genre, and that really ticks me off because they're not. And some of them are even more complicated because they don't even really fit into a category. They just change everything. I don't know if you could call them meta genres or something. There's probably a fancy name for them somewhere out there. But the genre categories that I usually focus on are one, world genre. That is what many think of when they think of genre. That is the kind of world that exists in the story: a fantasy world, a science fiction world, a post apocalyptic world, a world of supernatural horrors. That kind of genre is not so much about the story as it is about where the story takes place, and is very often the most elaborate kind of genre that gets developed. You don't develop a sci-fi story without developing the sci-fi world pretty well. Even if you don't intend to, it usually comes along all on its own. It might be a badly developed sci-fi world that doesn't make a lot of sense or just is plain boring, but you will have sci-fi elements in a sci-fi story, or it is in a sci-fi story, and those elements will be fairly plentiful, or at least very central to the story. So world genres are usually very heavy on the background information on the genre itself. It takes even if it's not the main part of the story, it takes up a lot of room because a lot of references, a lot of things that happen, a lot of people, a lot of items, a lot of situations will be entirely dependent on what kind of world has been designed. The next kind of genre is plot genre. And this is where we find things like action, we find things like crime stories or mysteries. We find, technically, we find horror here too, but that usually gets kind of mixed by a lot of people. But the actual horror in is supposed to be in the plot. There are a lot of horror stories that build as much upon some kind of twisted world as well, but the story itself becomes a horror story because of what's going on, not where it's going on. So it kind of gets a bit fuzzy on that one, but when you really look at it and when you really work with it, you can see the difference between a horror world and a horror plot. And they don't need to belong together, they just have a tendency to. You can have a horror plot in modern times, in fantasy times, in sci-fi times, without any horror world elements. There need to be no supernatural things. There don't even have to be any overly terrifying world components like psychotic killers or anything like that. A lot of horror stories can be made simply through the plot alone. Something in the plot is the scary part. Something in the plot is the horror. And from there, we go to the third one, which is style genre. And this is where it gets a little less concrete because style is not just something you slap into the story, it's how you create the entire story. It's kind of a layer on top of it. It's how you phrase the words. It's how you set the stage. It's how you carry out the entire story as it goes on. And this is where we also find the less concrete description because style can vary a lot and it's often very hard to say this is that style, this is the other style. On one extreme end of it, we have what's often called splatterpunk, which is when everything is just violence and gore and exploding heads and also violence and also gore. We also have a kindred spirit of splatterpunk that is grimdark, which is not so much about the violence and gore is definitely in there, but it's more about the hopelessness and the fact that everything is just driven dark. And if we go to the completely opposite side of the scale, we have silly, or slapstick, or comedy, where everything is basically made into a joke. No matter what the story is about, the real focus of it often becomes the jokey remarks, the silly situations, slip ups, things going wrong, or things going right in a very silly way. And between those two extremes, there are a lot of different, not just gray areas, but a lot of different things that can be focused on. There is noir, which is usually assumed to be 20s or 50s detective stories, but really doesn't have to be. It's just a very somber view of society as someone carries out a plot. And we have, I don't know if there's an actual word for it, but a very cheerful, optimistic, positive, but not silly or comedic
style, upbeat, you could perhaps call it, where everything is hopeful and you fight the bad things and you have a good chance of winning as long as you know the power of friendship. And that is a very common thing in children's or youth fiction because hopefulness is perhaps seen as a bit childish by our society, which is something that I'm not going to go into whether it's good or bad because that's a whole different discussion. But you also have styles that are a bit more specific around some idea like academic style, which in fact a lot of people don't realize that one of the horror masters, H.P. Lovecraft, often wrote very academically. It was almost like reading an academic report or the journals of an academically trained person. But his world genre was definitely horror, and the plots were definitely horror. But the style, very often, very academic. And then you have the ones that are more, like I said, could be called meta, but I don't really like using that word willy-nilly. But the one that really springs to mind is superheroes, because even though we're used to superheroes being a certain thing, it's really a very nebulous concept. You know, superheroes in any world genre, in any style genre, in any plot genre, uh, I'd say in any plot genre, as long as you adapt the story around it. All superhero genres really do is put someone with extreme abilities into the mix. In fact, some of the first quote unquote superheroes were not like the ones we know today. There were, there were superheroes like the Scarlet Pimpernel and Sorrow, who actually quite literally paved the way for superheroes. The Scarlet Pimpernel was, as far as I remember, a quote unquote hero who rescued aristocrats from the French Revolution. And there's a historic point of view that can get kind of interesting. We're not here to discuss that, but the idea was someone extremely skilled with almost supernatural abilities and fighting and the right to rescue what the leader considered to be good people in a bad situation. And Sorrow is more like what we would call here today, rescuing common folk from the abuses of corrupt government most of the time. And from what I've heard, Sorrow is actually the original template for Batman. A very rich, playboyish style person who dons a secret identity and fights for justice for the common folk. And just like Batman technically has no special abilities, Sorrow also technically has at least no supernatural abilities or fantastic abilities. He's just really good with a blade and very acrobatic, very skilled in general, and has the resources to carry out the heroic deeds that he carries out. So they are superheroes in the main sense of the word, but they're not in the modern age, and they're not the same kind of overpowered as, for example, Superman
And I guess Iron Man is an extreme version of the Zorro concept. And Iron Man is supposedly also inspired by Batman, which is fairly obvious when you think about it. But someone like Thor or someone like Stephen Strange, Doctor Strange, or Spider Man, those kind of powers, they are a different kind of superhero, but we're still talking superheroes. Highly skilled, talented, or people with special abilities who can take up the fight against greater evils than common folk usually can. Whether those evils are corrupt government or alien invaders or whatever superheroes go up against. And you can have superheroes in sci fi, fantasy, post apocalyptic, horror, any kind of stories. The one that might seem a bit odd is in horror, where one of the ideas is that you are, or the main character is essentially the victim. But that doesn't mean that the victim cannot be very skilled or have special abilities. It just means that the victim is up against something that is still very scary. And super heroes or super humans aren't really a style, a world, or a plot. It's definitely not a plot genre. There are too many plots that can be slapped into a superhero story. Batman, of course, was originally a detective. Also, some consider Sherlock Holmes to be a kind of superhero because the original Sherlock Holmes was even more obscenely skilled and almost clairvoyant about crime. But that's another discussion for another time. The only one I can really think of at this moment is superheroes that kind of crosses beyond categories. But I'm sure that there are others. But yeah, genre is a lot of things, and this video has now gone on for way too long. So I'll keep it at that. I may make a continuation of this um, in the future if I get to do these in the quality I'd like. They are probably going to be a bit on the long side, documentary style, more than just video style. But for now, I'll keep it in multiple small ones. So we'll keep it under 20 minutes.